Shavua Tov, everybody. It is wonderful to have congregations come together. That is, in fact, the way it should be. And you'll hear in this conversation, that's actually the way things are moving anyway. So what I wanted to do was give us an overview of where American Judaism has been and some of the challenges we're facing now. And you are all participants in those challenges. So hopefully I may be able to provide a framework and some information, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about, you'll have experienced in the world and in your families. When Jews first came to this country, and I want to divide the history of Jews in America has, like the Passover Seder, two beginnings, right? So the first beginning, Peter Stuyvesant, New Amsterdam, and there are Jews who move here as individuals, but they move into a country that is not their own, a country that has very strong Christian roots, very strong religious identity, and very strong racial identity. The Jews who moved here did not consider themselves, nor were they considered white. They were considered Jews. And what's intriguing to me about these brave souls who came to the New World is that they, by and large, were not successful in passing along their Jewish identity to the next generations. Almost every American Jew, most of you in this room, are descended from the great wave of immigrants who fled the Tsarist Russia and the Pale of Settlement, a move of millions of Jews who came from the 1880s into the 1920s when Congress shut down immigration. In that regard, you should note that American Jewry is different than Israeli Jewry. Most Israeli Jews are not Ashkenazic. They don't, most Israeli Jews come from the Middle East, North Africa, right? Most American Jews overwhelmingly come from the Pale of Settlement. So the second beginning of American Jewish life is the 1880s, when the Jews flee the Cossacks, Russian anti-Semitism, Polish anti-Semitism, and try to make a fresh beginning here. And the numbers come in such large waves that this is the founding period for American Jewish institutions that we know of today. Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Theological Seminary, Yeshiva University, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, ADL, all of these organizations are birthed in that period of time. And the primary agenda item that faced the Jewish community at that time is, how do we take these people and make them acceptable to America, which is a dual assignment. How do we make them Americans? And then how do we persuade Americans that they're Americans? So you have groups like the ADL that are working on making the argument that Jews can be good Americans, that there's actually no conflict between the deepest Jewish values and the deepest American identity. And that message permeated the official Jewish community through that period. It is also true that this time the challenge was to take these so-called greenhorns, these Jews who came from somewhere else, and Americanize them. Now, the task was made both more complicated and easier by the fact that the Jews who came to America were overwhelmingly the least educated and the least religious, right? Simply because the rabbis of Europe said it's forbidden to go there. America was, in their mind, treif, right? You're going to go there, you're going to get seduced by the lifestyle and the opulence, right? And you'll abandon your Yiddishkeit. So the rabbis of Europe prohibited coming to this country, which meant that the Jews who came were the ones who didn't care, right? I often think about all the tefillin straps and all the scheitels that were thrown overboard somewhere on the trip across the Atlantic, a whole lot of frum fish swimming around with Jewish ritual objects, right? But these newcomers come to America and they don't need to be made Jewish. They need to be taught how to get along in America. So you start having classes at the YMCA or the YMHA because they wouldn't go to the CA, but they're learning how to act like Americans. You start to have Jewish social clubs that are organized by where in the Jewish world you're from. The Lithuanians had a club, and people had clubs based on where they were from. And at those clubs, you would learn to sit at a set table and eat American food, right? There were programs to teach people English. Some of you may remember the Hyman Kaplan series of comedy writings. It's about a Jew who teaches immigrants how to speak English. It's hysterically funny. But that was the task at hand, and then persuading Americans that we were not a threat, which we were seen as. And at the time, the birth of denominations was very much part of that story. So I grew up, for example, at Congregation Emmanuel in San Francisco, which is a big, magnificent classical reform congregation. To my mind, the most beautiful sanctuary in North America. And it was founded by German Jews who didn't want Russian Jews hanging around. So they built a building based on Moorish architecture, right? There was this kind of notion that the glory days of the Jews was in Spain, when Jews were part of some larger cultural mix. P.S. Scholars of medieval Spain will tell you that cultural mix existed only in the minds of Spanish Jews. But it loomed large for German Jews too, which is why both in Germany and in the United States, many of the Reform synagogues were built not to look Middle Eastern and certainly not to look Slavic. They were built to look Germanic, or they were built to look Mediterranean. So this congregation, Germanic Jews, where the prayer book was in Hebrew, Reform prayer book, Hebrew and German until the Union prayer book came out, right? That shaped the environment because that congregation was to be outward looking to the larger community. It was one of the, it still is, one of the proudest edifices of religious life in San Francisco. The message being, we are just as San Franciscan as Grace Cathedral. And it was incredibly successful in its mission. That first generation created rabbinical training programs that for the first time ever, HUC, JTS, the rabbis learned how to preach in English. The rabbis had to have a college degree, right, which was radical at the time. The rabbi had to have a Western education and a Western demeanor. And an interesting fact that many people don't know, Jewish Theological Seminary, the oldest and largest conservative seminary, was founded by Reform Jews, Lewis Marshall, people like that, who realized, the Eastern Jews never go to the big Reform cathedral-style synagogues, and they wouldn't appreciate HUC, which would look to them too not Jewish. So they needed a place that looked more Jewish, but would still infect them with Americanism. And that's why they funded Schechter's seminary, because Schechter would Americanize these boys, and they would then create congregations for the Russians, which would alleviate the Temple Emmanuels of the world from having to deal with them applying to be members there. Right? So that first generation, the task was to fight anti-Semitism and to Americanize the Jews. They were so successful that the task of the next generation was quite different. Starting in the 50s, but picking up steam in the 60s, that was the age of free to be you and me. You remember Marlo Thomas's, right, wonderful album and book, right? Well, that applied to a lot of us. Right? This is the age of the Black Power movement, in which African Americans start to wear their hair in their own way. and they start to wear Africanized clothing in public, and they start to insist, thank God, that we don't have to melt in with you. We can be ourselves in public and still be American. And the women's movement, if you think about it, was largely the same message. There are pictures of my mother from the early 60s to the late 60s are like two different women, right? Because the early 60s picture, she has her hair in this puffy thing, and she got jewelry and she has gloves on when she goes downtown, right? And by the end of the 60s, that is not how she looks anymore. So the women's movement also had the message of you don't have to meet their standards, whoever they are. You can be yourself. In fact, you should be yourself. Well, we picked up on that, we Jews. I think in part because of the women's movement, in part because of Black liberation, and in part because of the 67 war. So I just want to bring you back to that moment. The 67 war was for many American Jews a wake-up moment. It was the moment where we realized that Israel was frail, under assault, and that was us. At the end of that war, American Jewish anti-Zionism pretty much evaporated. The synagogue I grew up in, Emmanuel, was the center of an organization dedicated to non-Zionist Judaism. That institution collapsed. The opposition of liberal rabbis disappeared, right? And suddenly, American Jewry Zionized. And that meant that the message was no longer, how can we fit in and be real Americans? That was Louis Brandeis's big issue. Our issue was, how can we be authentically Jewish and claim our place in the mosaic of cultures that is America today? That's a very different agenda. So you start to have Hebrew schools of all denominations having conversations not about the ways that Jewish values and American values are aligned, but what are the places where they're different? And how do we teach Jewish kids to be proud of the difference and not to erase that difference? Jews had already broken through in most industries. They were living in any neighborhood. The high school that I attended in the Bay Area had been 10 years earlier one that didn't admit Jewish people. But by the time I got there, none of us knew that. So the issue wasn't acceptance. The issue was what's distinct about us and how do we celebrate that distinctiveness? And we are at the tail end of that period. You can tell by the people who showed up over the weekend that our institutions have really succeeded in creating a space in which Jews feel comfortable. What we didn't anticipate, many of us, is the resurgence of virulent anti-Semitism, the ways in which racial and ethnic animosity have not disappeared in this country and keep resurging, the fragility and militance of partisan politics. I don't mean by that people have strong opinions. We've always had strong opinions, but it does look to me that in the last 10 years, politics is no longer a heated conversation with someone that you then break bread with. It's a winner-take-all fight in which you break something on top of the person you're fighting with, and then relationships get shattered. So how do we, in a world in which we have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, let me give you a couple examples of that I don't think people talk about enough. The one thing that the two presidential candidates for this upcoming election share in common, I can't think of two things, but I can think of this. They both have Jewish in-laws and Jewish grandchildren. Can you imagine if that had been true of, I don't know, Eisenhower? You know, like we don't talk about the fact that Trump orders the same Hanukkah PJs for his grandchildren that Biden does. There was a picture last December of President Biden's grandson coming to the White House for a sleepover with his grandparents, and he was wearing Hanukkah menorah pajamas. And that picture appeared in all the papers in the United States. And I'm thinking this would be a Proud Boy nightmare, right? Pity the anti-Semites who have to look at that picture. And the thing is, it won't get better if their candidate wins. There'll still be Jewish grandchildren schlepping into the White House. Yeah. They both have Jewish chiefs of staff. There are Jews in the cabinet all over the place. There are 2 Jews on the Supreme Court. My state, the great state of California, until recently had Jewish lady senators. 2. That's out of a total of 2. And what's striking about it is no one thought that was worth saying anything about. Like that wasn't a reason to not vote for Dianne Feinstein. But that's amazing because it's hard to imagine a time or place where that wouldn't have been a conversation. So we have, despite the challenges, succeeded so thoroughly that the task remaining is why should a young Jew put effort into Jewish engagement? And frankly, not just a young Jew, most old Jews aren't either, right? Because we live in the age of the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, right? I can't tell you the last time I listened to a DJ's choice of what music I should hear, right? I listen to my music, and half of the time I flip through the songs that I'm the one that put those songs on the list, right? So we have institutions that are set up for an age that doesn't have iPads. Adult education will be Wednesday night at 7:30. Please come here so-and-so, then in this room. But our people don't do that with anything else in their lives. My wife loves listening to podcasts. Me personally, if I wake up after I die and there are podcasts going on, I will know that I did terrible, terrible things in this life, right? But she to whoever she wants to hear when she wants to hear it. And the idea of getting up in the middle of the week and going to some room to hear some pre-scheduled thing, that's just not going to happen. So I think one of the challenges facing Jewish life today is how do we re-understand what Jewish affiliation looks like? It doesn't mean what it meant. Until fairly recently, what affiliation meant for most Jews was you walk into a building, you take out a checkbook, and you write a check. Then you're a member. And then if you're a member, then the rare times you show up, the people there will guilt you into why are you not showing up more often? And for this, you pay. But that isn't happening anymore. They did a poll in Los Angeles. The Federation sponsored a study of the Jewish community, and they asked which group has the greatest number of Jewish contacts in the course of a week? 30 and under, 40, 50, 60 and up. You know who has the most frequent Jewish contacts? 30 and under. 30 and under. Because you guys show up to the synagogue once or twice a week. But your grandchildren are listening to Jewish music, watching Jewish news, watching Israeli movies. They're engaged in Jewish conversations on whatever app I've never even heard of, right? Now, we don't know if that's going to be lasting. We don't know if that will actually inform Jewish identity. I'm not saying that's a success, but what I am saying is in terms of frequency of Jewish connection, the younger people are contacting the community, their community, more often. So we haven't figured out to serve them. We haven't figured out how to reach them or what works to be able to meet their needs. Here's another interesting thing. The largest growing group within the Jewish people in America today is Jewish by identity, by religion, none. Fastest growing group. About 25% of American Jews say, I don't practice any religion and I'm Jewish. And then if you ask those Jews, is being Jewish unimportant, somewhat important, important or very important? 80% say important and very important. Here's the one I really don't get. Not at all religious, 15% of them think that God gave us the land of Israel. I've lost sleep trying to figure that out. Right? But what it suggests to me is that Jews, young Jews too, are hungry for a Judaism and that it may be we need to think about Judaism not just as a religion, which is the American category, but as an identity. So here I want to say something you may not have heard from a rabbi before. I don't know the rabbis in this room well enough to know. In the biblical period, Judaism was not a religion. There is, in fact, no biblical word for religion. It's not a category, none. And Judaism becomes a religion, religio, which is a Latin word, in the Roman Empire, because that's a Roman category, right? You have two kinds of religions. You have religio licita, which is legitimate religion, like Zeus and Zoroaster and Moses. Like a fine wine for the Romans, religion had to be ancient, none of this newfangled stuff, right? So new religions, like there's this thing about a guy on a cross, right? Those people are fed to the lions, right? Because it's a new religion, bogus. We became a religion in diaspora because we needed to fit their category. I wonder whether it's a coincidence that at the time that we re-entered our own land and we once again became a nation, that now for young Jews, Judaism isn't a religion, it's their identity. It's who they are. And they're very interested in exploring their identity. They're just not sure they want to hear it as a religion. And we haven't pivoted to give them that. What would it look like if Judaism were a culture, an ethos, a wisdom tradition? And what if we could present the riches of Jewish cultural insight, which includes ideas about the supernatural and about the meaning of the world? But we're not the same. I've always felt there was a show in Los Angeles years ago. Dennis Prager used to run a show called Religion on the Line, and he would invite a priest and a minister and a rabbi, right? I often played the part of rabbi when he couldn't find one. And I would always have a sense that we weren't the equivalent, that what I was for my community was not the same thing as what the priest and the minister were for theirs. Among other things, the priest and the minister could tell their people what they believed. I can't imagine any synagogue that would have a here's what we believe as part of their membership packet. Think about it as an experiment. Could you put anything on that piece of paper as a Jew, I believe, and then just put whatever bullet points you got? I'm willing to bet that it's going to be a blank pad by the end of the process with a lot of scratch outs, right? We're not the same. I am a communal chieftain is what I am, right? And I represent my tribe, not the same. So I wonder if this is the age in which the Jewish people, thanks to Israel and what the 21st century has made possible, emerges from the shackles of being a religion and becomes a civilization again, a people. Maybe that's who we are. But if we are, what do we need to do to bring that to our people? So I'll share with you one last heresy, and then I want to open it to you to talk about the future. It is clear that denominations will never again mean what they used to mean. Never. I don't think denominations are going away, and I don't want them to. And I don't think synagogues are going away, and I don't want them to either. But I don't think people care as much about denominations. I will confess to you my sins. I don't. Not like I wake up in the morning thinking, what can I do for conservative Judaism? I wake up thinking, what can I do for the Jewish people and for Judaism? My guess is that's what my Reform colleague is thinking in the morning too, right? I tell people that we are approaching a time at which the label of a denomination will pertain to an institution, but not to the people in the institution. Try that on for a moment. You're not a conservative Jew. You're a member of a conservative synagogue. Your rabbi isn't a conservative rabbi. He or she went to a conservative seminary. Your rabbi is not a Reform rabbi. He's a rabbi who went to a Reform seminary, right? And you're not a Reform Jew. You're a Jew who likes a Reform synagogue, right? I wonder if that's not the world we're moving towards, in which there will be real differences of practice and culture and comfort levels and like all that. but it won't put us into separate categories as people. We're just Jews. And what I think that highlights is we will either all figure out what will work moving forward or we will all fail. It's not like there's going to be winners and losers. Judaism will be irreversibly pluralistic. It will be diverse. We will have different ways of doing Jewish and of being Jewish, as befits a great nation. There are many ways to be a good American, and there is no one way that every American agrees to. There are many ways to be a passionate Jew, and we don't need to have everybody walking on the same tracks. We just need to support everybody and give people the tools that they need so that their connections to the Jewish people are meaningful and significant and satisfying. That, I believe, is the task. And that's what we need to turn to, because among other things, we've raised a generation of children who expect excellence. When they go to the movies, they expect them to be excellent. When they go to a concert, they expect it to be excellent. And they're not going to put up with mediocrity just because we're Jews. So we need to be able to find a way to deliver excellence. Happy to hear your comments. Look, those of you who watched me praying today may have noticed I'm fairly traditional. Pray out of an all Hebrew Orthodox prayer book. I like it because it lays out the Hebrew like poetry, so I don't confuse it for prose. I daven with my tallis over my head. I'm not calling for radical changes in practice. I'm calling for a new way of thinking about it. So when you think about Judaism as a religion, you think about a theology, because religions have theologies. Here's what we believe. There isn't a list of belief that has worked for the Jewish people. Maimonides tried, Rav Sadia tried. Nobody, I mean, they printed in a prayer book, but go down that list and you put your initials next to each one that you agree with personally, and you'll see what I mean. And then there's shared behavior, but you tell me, does everybody in your shul practice the same? I don't think so either. Well, so let me, I was about to get to the Gvina Gedola. Does everybody in your congregation believe in God? They do in mine, but I've never asked them specifically, so I'm just assuming. I'm assuming, in the same way, by the way, I'm assuming that on Yom Kippur, when I bow all the way to the ground, I assume that all 1,200 of them do the same. And I've never looked up to check on them because that would be insulting, right? So, and the other thing is, which God do they believe in? Do they believe in the God who answers them personally? Do they believe in God who is a force underlying it all? Do they believe in God who is the ideals of the Jewish people? Do they believe in the God who is the sum total of everything that exists? Like, which God do you not believe in? And then there are plenty of Jews. The old joke, Friedman comes to talk to God and I come to talk to Friedman, right? There are plenty of people. The congregation that I'm part of, Ikar, they have coffee out in the lobby. Really good coffee, by the way, and 5 kinds of whiteners because we are a progressive community, right? So you can get whitening fluids that you didn't even know existed. And don't get me started on what can sweeten the coffee, too. There are plant species that I'm convinced they just invented for the labeling, right? But there's a whole lot of people who use the sermon moment to get up and walk out of the room and have a good cup of coffee, and a fair number of people who don't make it back in for Musaf. Right? So what I mean by shifting from religion is not that we don't have a deep spirituality. The Bible had deep spirituality. They just didn't think of what they were doing as religion. They thought of it as being a Jew. And I wonder if we could do that, then what that would do is it would liberate people to do whatever they want to do. So I'll give you 2 for instances that I have noticed. I used to be shocked when rabbinical students applied to my school with tattoos. I am now shocked when they don't, right? That fight has been lost. You don't have to like it or not. I'm delighted that my children are too old to do that anymore, but I have students who have what do they call them? Body suits. Like everything that has clothing on has been tattooed. Um, and they want to go to a conservative rabbinical school, right? Like that's interesting, isn't it? And I used to be judgy about it, and I'm just grateful that they're showing up, right? I think it's wonderful that they're coming. At the end of a bar mitzvah speech, people break out into applause now. That didn't used to happen back in the day. Oh, here's another one that's now common. Bar mitzvah father and son wear a beautiful suit, often a kind of Paris blue, and then white sneakers so blinding that if you look down, you won't see for 10 minutes. Not yet. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, who cares? If the parents like it and it makes the kid happy, who cares? So I think what has fallen away is the artificial long list of decorum expectations that people are waking up and saying, we don't need that anymore, right? The rabbis show up not wearing a tie, and that's fine. Well, not of course. Fairly recently, that wasn't okay. But whether you like it or not, it's not changing anymore. I'm often the only one in the room wearing a tie because I'm a Reformed Jew from San Francisco in the 70s, and that's just how you dress. That's all. Speaking about unchanging halacha, right? So I think what it's about is about new vessels for old liquids, right? The liquid is the wisdom and the embrace of Jewish identity. The old containers don't serve anymore. And if we keep trying to force the liquid into the old containers, we will speak to a dwindling number of aging people. But if we can find a container that looks attractive to the next generation, they're hungry for what's inside the container. They are hungry for that. We just need to find a way to deliver it to them. Well, I'm saying something a little more complicated than that. I'm not taking out the religion. I'm just not thinking of it as religion, right? Religion is a uniquely Western category. It turns out that in Hindi, there's no word for religion either, right? Taoism doesn't think of itself as a religion. Buddhism is a way. So what if Judaism is the way we walk in the world? It's what we share with each other. It's how we plug into cosmic wisdom, right? But religion is do's and pews and don'ts and scowling clergy. And like there's a whole lot of things that we'd actually be well advised to jettison, right? But I'm not getting rid of kashrut or Shabbat or tefillin or studying scripture or blessing our kids. Well, that don't get me started on right. There's a lot. I just want to put it in a different mental category is what I want to do. Let me give you an example of what I mean. It's hard to analogize that. My father passed away 2.5 years ago. I miss him very much. Um, my father used to say of someone, he's a man's man. And I never knew what he was talking about when he said that. Like, I don't know what a man's man is, and I also don't know what the alternative is. And it's not like my dad was John Wayne. So, like, you wouldn't know a man's man if he bit you in the butt, right? That doesn't mean men and women have gone away just because we've changed our understanding of what gender is and isn't, right? One of the things is I'm just not so hung up on it anymore. Categorize yourself however you want. I don't care. And be who you want to be. I also don't care. Um, People will come in all kinds of diverse ways. And our job isn't to categorize them. Our job is to see them and to welcome them and to embrace them, right? And so I think that's what I mean by the shift from religion. Religion is all about classifying and categorizing and then saying, is it inside or outside? And I think that approach has worn itself out. And that what we should try is loving our traditions and our inheritance sufficiently that we share it with anyone who will hear it. and people are invited to try them on. I'll give you a for instance that I witnessed. One of my rabbis is Sharon Brous, who's an incredibly talented um, rabbi. And she just came out with her first book, which is an amazing book called The Amen Effect. And its central idea, which is core to who she is we have to show up for each other. And she discovered a Mishnah. And what I mean by discovered is we've been reading the Mishnah for 1,000 years. I never heard anyone teach this one until Sharon did. And now in my head, it's always Sharon's Mishnah. Right? There's a Mishnah that teaches that when the Jews would do their pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to Mount Zion, there was a door that you would enter in. And if everything was going well in your life, you would go in a circle around the courtyard to the right. And if you were brokenhearted for whatever reason, you would go to the left. And then when you met someone coming from the right, they would say, Ma shlomech, what's happening with you? Tell me your story. I read that Mishnah in rabbinical school and no one thought of it. It was her genius to say, this is actually big. So she had us do it in the synagogue. We actually got up, and the people whose lives were hunky-dory walked this way, and the people who were brokenhearted for one reason or another walked this way. And then people had to stop them and say, tell me what's up with you. And I watched people sobbing and crying and hugging. Nobody asked them, do you keep kosher outside of the house? Nobody asked them, did you check your suits for shatnez? Nobody said, did you come to the synagogue this morning and did you say all the prayers in the prayer book? No, they just said, I see you. Tell me what's up. And that's the Mishnah, right? This hasn't been practiced in Jewish life for 2,000 years, and we were doing it. And it was incredibly powerful. That's what I'm talking about. Let's make the traditions live again and not worry about how we think of them. I have a twofold answer to that. I work at American Jewish University. We have a summer camp called Alonim, which has 900 children every summer out in Simi Valley. And I've also been on the board of Camp Ramah of California, and I helped in Ojai, and I helped create Ramah of Northern California, which meets in the Monterey Bay. I'm a big fan of Jewish summer camps. And what I can tell you is that they are amazing and unique and a crucial part of the constellation, and they don't produce frumkeit. They don't make people observant. You're allowed to not believe what I say. It's a noble and long tradition of not believing what I'll say. Thank you. That's very gracious of you. I really, I'm going to take his. Thank you. Hold on, I'm mid-answer. There are lots of kids who at Camp Ramah or Camp Hess Kramer or Camp whatever get turned on by Judaism and love it. And there are many kids who go there and put up with the Jewish because they love the camp. My Gesundheit, my daughter was one of them, right? There you go. Thank you. That, by the way, is how you say F you to a visiting rabbi. So I think the camps are crucial. I don't think Judaism can survive without the summer camps. I think people being in a place where Judaism is just part of the air and the atmosphere is essential. I think what it produces uniformly is people who think that being Jewish is beautiful and normal. And that's separate from are they observant or not. Some will go on to be more observant, some won't, and it still makes a huge difference, right? My daughter continually surprises me by knowing Jewish things that I know she learned at Ramah when she was trying to not listen, right? It's more like a virus than a classroom. You just catch it by breathing it, right? So, you know, she'll raise her hand and watch this in a high school class where they want to know how many kinds of Kaddises there were. And my daughter raised her hand and answered the question like, how in the world do you know that? Right? Apparently, little piece of advice, taking a siddur and holding it under your armpit for a certain amount of time, the knowledge just goes straight into the bloodstream somehow. It's a miracle. So Camp Ramah was crucial for my Shira. And I see among her classmates how important those friendships go on into their adult life. And they loop her back into Jewish community. So I can't think of any Jewish institutions more important than summer camps. And I'm, of course, a big fan of Camp Ramah.
is when I read the prayers, saying, give me a break.
Right. And I think that's a reasonable struggle. So part of the challenge is that we have defined Jewish education as mechanical. Learn the Hebrew, learn when you stand, when you sit, when you take 3 steps forward, when you take 3 steps back, what's the melody for Isaiah, what's the difference between Sukkot and Shavuot, right? That's, but we haven't figured out how to teach is how it feels. The moment of Jewish education I'm most proud of in my own life, I was for 10 years a congregational rabbi in Southern California. This is the period of my life that my mother refers to as when you were a rabbi. And one afternoon during Hebrew school, there was thunder and lightning, and the rain was pouring down. And I ran through the Hebrew school, taking the kids out of the classroom so that we could stand on the balcony and shout the bracha for thunder and lightning, which we did for an hour. And the kids never forgot that bracha. And they never forgot that moment, right? Because what I did was I said, this is an extraordinary moment and there's a Jewish response. And so we had 200 Jewish kids on the balcony shouting out Hebrew brachot to the skies, right? And I didn't lecture them about it. This is what we say to appreciate the miracle of that. I didn't do any of that. I just said, shout with me. And then I started shouting, right? But years later, I run into those now adults and they say, do you remember the day that we shouted to the lightning? Yeah, I do. And so do you. So I think we need to, in our education systems, focus at least as much on what's the emotional impact of this. And to you, what I would recommend, part of the challenge, I've noticed this at synagogues all around the world. If you have a bar bat mitzvah, and many of them have this ritual called the passing of the Torah. Grandparents are given the Torah, they pass it to the parents, they pass the kids. Everybody's weepy. And the only thing you can do to stop people from crying is unroll the book and start to read from it, right? Because the content isn't what they're crying over, it's the continuity. So I want to invite you as a community to come up with some adult ed about the Siddur as poetry. Because I think one of the problems is we read the book as though it's prose, and then it's really uninspiring. But if you read Elizabeth Browning as prose, you wouldn't like her either. Shakespeare, if you take him literally, is not very good. But we understand these are poetic metaphors, and we translate them using our poetry brain. The Siddur is poetry, and a lot of the issues you have with it would be a lot resolved if you could read it as the poetry that it is. What's it getting at? Not the point that it's making. What's the feeling it's trying to evoke? I know. Yes, right? Right. Good. So then let me invite you to do something really heretical. When you get to the Amidah, close the book and close your eyes. And here's what I want you to do, but I have something for you to do while you're doing that. Do you wear a talit? All right. Cover yourself with your talit. Close your eyes. There are 3 Hebrew letters that function in the Bible as vowels and consonants, right? They didn't have the little vowels. That's from the 9th century. I'm just saying. So the 3 Hebrew vowel letters that are vowels are Yud, Hey, and Vav. Turns out it's not that you're not allowed to say God's name. It's all vowels. The only way you can say God's name is to breathe. Every time you breathe in and breathe out, you're breathing all vowels. Consonants are what gives it sound. So what I want you to do is breathe in and breathe out Yud Hey. Just breathe in and out the universe, life, the one. Do that for however long people are doing the Amidah and see if that feels more meaningful. It might. Try it. You have to speak louder.
The feeling is, what can this do for me? What is it? You know, there are certain stages where in life where it's not necessarily what you could do for me. There are connections one has to one's parent, one's grandparent, and it. Okay, I guess I kind of need to make it closer. But you talk about different things that occur, but I have to casually disagree with you because I think the entry point is the synagogue and is, you know, I guess what I want you to do is make the differentiate between the synagogue and religion. You don't necessarily need, or what I'm understanding is that you don't necessarily see religion because there are people out there that want to be good moral Jews, that do the right thing, that are listening to podcasts. But for me, that's fine. But the entry point still has to be the synagogue. I'm a baseball fan, and you can change a lot of the rules, but there's still there are certain things you can't change. And one of those things I think you can't change is that you can do different things within the synagogue. And maybe when you enter the synagogue, maybe you don't go to services every Saturday, but you still have to have that entry point in order to enjoy all the benefits of Judaism.
So I agree with a lot of what you say, and I have a problem. I think that once we start to talk about the entry point, you've already locked out a lot of people. I know a lot of Jews who feel very Jewish who are scared of the front door of the synagogue. And if what you tell them is the bottom line is you have to enter the building before you can engage, they won't. And I don't disagree with you. I think there are things that can only happen in a congregation. I think that having a sense of community is vital to one's health. Look, we live in a time in which Americans are lonely and anxious in unprecedented numbers. And we live at an age in which Americans don't join things in unprecedented numbers. And I think those are related, those two pieces of information. So I don't disagree with you. But I also know that practically, if we say to people, you have to enter the synagogue in order to start collecting the goods, there will be a lot of people who won't or can't. So what I want to say is the synagogue is a set of relationships. It's not a place. It's not an edifice. Synagogue is the relationships. So I want you to take those relationships where we can find the people. We do summer services at the beach. And there are a whole lot of people who show up for those services who don't show up when, right. So I think it's about, are there ways that the functioning of the synagogue can be carried out of the building? Not instead of in the building, but in addition to, because there are just a lot of people who it's too scary to come through these doors. It's too scary to look at a room full of people who are not your age. It's too scary to listen to people who are praying in a language that you don't speak. And here I want to say it's not just the language, because I also do scholar in residences at Reform synagogues where language isn't the issue, and they still look a lot like conservative congregations to me. So there have to be multiple points of entrance. That's what I meant by the iPad generation. People are used to having the apps they want when they want them. So we need to figure out what are the multiple ways. Some people, their Judaism will be about learning. And some people, it will be about dance and music. And some people, their primary point will be social action. And some people, it will be about socializing. There isn't the entry point anymore. Those days are gone. They just won't work. They work for you and me. I will always be a shul Jew, but I'm kind of unique in my family. So you don't want to have that be the only way. Others. Yeah. So here's, I think, a challenge. Let me put it in a different way. When Mr. Wrigley invented chewing gum, there was no market for chewing gum. So I don't know if you know the story about Wrigley and his gum, but he sent a stick of gum. He mailed it to every household in the country, right? And overnight created a market for gum. It says something about Americans that some total stranger mails you something and says, put this in your mouth. And the whole country said, sure. But in a sense, what do you do when Americans are telling you that they are literally dying of loneliness? They are literally, that's not a metaphor, they are literally dying of loneliness, and we have the solution, but they don't know that that's the solution. Look at the way congregations get portrayed in the media, in movies. Synagogues are boring, hypocritical, showing off wealth, meaningless liturgy. The mockery of what goes on in a synagogue is endless. You can't find a film where look, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which I loved, right? The synagogue and the rabbi were buffoons, right? That's not funny, right? So how do we help people? We have the antidote, and they're not willing to give it a try. So what I'm talking about is we don't disagree, but how do I show them the synagogue in a way that's not threatening, embracing, welcoming, so they can say, oh, this was here all along, right? This is what I've been looking for, right? When my father passed away, my congregation was amazing. I would not have survived Shiva without Ikar. They were incredible. The lay people, the rabbis, everybody. My siblings don't have a community. They have wonderful, wonderful friends who are like family, but that's not community. So they zoomed in to our Shiva, right? And I was so proud of my community and these aren't people that I would call up and say, let's go have a drink, let's go out to dinner, let's go. Like, they're the people who, if I don't see them on Saturday, I call and say, are you okay? Right? And every Saturday we give a hug, we exchange words, we check up on each other. But I don't know how you make it in the world without community, right? And so part of what we have to help get the word out to people is that's what you have a right to expect in your life. And that's what makes these difficult times bearable, right? Because there's a place to go where people are looking for you. Most of you at this point, you have your regular place you sit, right? And people know I have the place that I sit. Rabbi Brous uses that as a prop in her sermons from time to time. Imagine what it's like having to preach with Rabbi Artson sitting right there, she says. But having that makom kavua means there are people that I smile at across the room and look at across the room, and that's part of my network of care. So how do we open that up to people? And I guess what I'm saying, one second, what I'm saying is it can't be come into this room and I'll show you. Because for some people, that's already too big a step. So how can we take the essence of what's in the room and bring it out to people in a way that isn't threatening so that they can experience it enough to say, oh, that's what you're talking about. That's great. I need that. Because they do. They desperately need that. Rabbi, you wanted to say something?
Third spaces being created. So there is a space, but the threshold is high. The only other thing I'll say is I think all of our communities are actually bigger than our campuses.
Right.
So maybe there's a program where we do something social action oriented or advocating or outside the building, it's still the community doing it. It's just not always happening.
Thank you. And I'm sorry. So let me give you a piece of wisdom that I got from my wife years ago. I was a young congregational rabbi, and I was deeply frustrated because I was pouring my heart and soul into the congregation, and they were still not showing up for every service, every class, every whatever. And I thought I just need to hustle more to do that. And one night, I think she got so exasperated by me that she said, listen, I want to tell you this. I'm only going to say it once. Listen up. If you define success as they are keeping kosher, Shabbos observant, davening 3 times a day, you will have a handful of successes in your career, and you'll ignore all the successes you've had. So I want to give you a different way to look at it. Here's what success looks like. For the larger circle, success is whatever contact they have with you or the Jewish community, at the end of it, they think it was worthy and they're glad they did it. And that may not lead to anything else. It may be that they say that was really great, right? Every rabbi has had this, the number of people who tell me that's your greatest sermon ever. And I want to say, how would you know? So for the larger number, Success is every point of contact, however sporadic, was worthwhile and positive. Some of those people will be inspired by that to cross the line. And the line is for more regular engagement. They'll start coming to the weekly Talmud class. They'll start coming to the adult ed program. They'll sign up for the adult bar bat mitzvah. They'll sign up for whatever. That's also success, and you're allowed to feel great about that too. You just can't erase all the other successes. And I've carried that in life because I think there's huge wisdom to it. Right? So those sporadic people who lobby for Israel but never cross the threshold to walking into the service for a regular service, that's still a success. They have a rabbi, they have a community, they're taking from it what they're willing to take from it. Feel good about that. And there will be some of them who will come to the synagogue because there's an Israel service, or there's a let's honor the people who came to DC to lobby, or whatever. And in the middle of it, they'll find themselves humming along and thinking, hey, this is not so bad, right? And some of those will be inspired by that to take the rabbi's class because they really like being with him on the bus on the way to DC. Like, you just don't know where things are going to play out. You also don't know how it's going to play out for their kids, right? So the parents may never make that next step, but the kid says, you have a special relationship. I want to get to know the rabbi too. I'm going to sign up for the confirmation class. So just having lots of options, lots of easy ways to enter, and not creating a hierarchy among them, just let them all be. And what that involves is trusting our people. So here's what I want to close with. God did not choose a person in our tradition. God did something that no ancient god ever did, ever. The Egyptian gods never talked to common people, ever. They were not interested in common people. They were interested in Pharaoh, and the Book of the Dead is how, if you're a Pharaoh, you can get into the next world. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, not once does a commoner speak. Not once. Even the slaves who speak in the Iliad and the Odyssey are kidnapped royalty. It doesn't occur to the Greek gods to care about a Greek. Out of that, the Torah creates a tradition in which the God of the universe speaks to these nobodies, to Abraham and Sarah and their no-goodnik children, right? And then, as if that's not enough, God finds out that their great-grandkids are enslaved in Egypt, and the God of the universe doesn't talk to Pharaoh. He talks to this nobody, Moshe, and has him go talk to Pharaoh, and then he does signs and wonders and brings us out. There is no literature in the ancient world like that. Not a single story, not a single book. It has always been one Jew at a time. And if that's enough for God, that should be enough for us. We all have an edifice complex. Catch that? We all think the solution is a building or a program or a whistle ring or a chant. And it's not. It's one Jew at a time. It's one relationship at a time. Let's go back to basics.